The Galactic Confederation's Academy of Higher Learning stood like a crystal spire against the purple sky of Nexus Prime. For 3,000 years, it had served as the most prestigious educational institution in known space, where the brightest minds from across 17 different species came to prove their intellectual worth. The Academy's entrance examination was legendary, a test so difficult that even the most brilliant scholars often spent decades preparing for it. Sarah Chun stepped off the transport shuttle, her worn leather boots clicking against the pristine marble floors of the Academy's grand entrance hall. At 22, she was younger than most candidates by at least a decade. Her simple brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the standard-issue jumpsuit of a freight hauler, hardly the formal attire expected of Academy candidates. Around her, beings from across the galaxy moved with purpose and confidence. The tall, blue-skinned Etherians floated gracefully through the air, their multiple arms carrying elaborate data tablets and reference materials. The insectoid klaxons clicked and chittered as they reviewed complex mathematical formulas projected from their cybernetic implants. The crystalline Vortons hummed in harmonic frequencies, sharing knowledge through sonic resonance. Sarah felt distinctly out of place. She had grown up on a mining station in the Outer Rim, where her education came from salvaged textbooks and whatever data files she could download during rare supply runs. Her application to the Academy had been submitted on a whim, using credits saved from her job hauling cargo between asteroid colonies. "Attention all candidates," announced a melodious voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The examination will begin in 1 standard hour. Please proceed to Preparation Chamber 7 for final briefing and mental conditioning." As Sarah followed the crowd through corridors lined with holographic displays showing the Academy's greatest achievements, she couldn't help but notice the stares and whispers her presence generated. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. While they had proven themselves capable traders and explorers, they were not widely regarded as intellectual equals to the elder races. The preparation chamber was a vast spherical room with seating arranged in concentric circles. Sarah found herself wedged between a klaxon whose chittering was giving her a headache and an Etherian who kept glancing at her with what she assumed was disdain. At the center of the chamber, a hologram materialized, the image of Dean Corvash, an ancient vegan whose species was renowned for their philosophical wisdom. His 3 eyes surveyed the assembled candidates with the weight of millennia. "Welcome, aspirants," Dean Corvash began, his voice carrying the authority of ages. "Today, you face the synthesis examination, a test that has remained unchanged for 3,000 years. It is not merely a measure of knowledge, but of understanding, of wisdom, of the ability to perceive the fundamental nature of existence itself." A murmur of nervous excitement rippled through the chamber. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. "The examination consists of a single question," the dean continued. "You will have exactly 1 hour to provide your answer. The question has been posed to over 40,000 candidates in the Academy's history. Only 6 have answered correctly." Sarah's mouth went dry. 6 correct answers out of 40,000 attempts. The odds were astronomical. Those who answer correctly will be granted immediate admission to the Academy, with full scholarships and access to the most advanced educational resources in the galaxy. Those who answer incorrectly, the dean paused meaningfully, will be permanently barred from reapplying. The weight of that statement settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. Sarah looked around at the other candidates, many of whom had spent their entire adult lives preparing for this moment. The Etherian beside her was trembling slightly, his blue skin taking on a pale tint. "Before we begin," Dean Corvash continued, "I must inform you that this year's examination carries additional significance. The question you're about to face is the same one that has been asked for 3 millennia. However, our analysis suggests that the fundamental nature of the question may be changing due to recent developments in galactic society." Sarah wondered what that meant, but the dean offered no further explanation. You may now proceed to the examination hall. Remember, you have 1 hour and 1 hour only. The fate of your academic future rests on your response to a single question. As the candidates filed out of the preparation chamber, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation in dozens of languages and communication methods. The Klaxons were sharing computational strategies through rapid clicking patterns. The Etherians were discussing philosophical frameworks in their melodic tongue. The Vortons were harmonizing in frequencies that made her teeth ache. Everyone seemed to have a strategy, a methodology, a systematic approach to tackling the unknown question. Sarah had none of that. All she had was a restless mind that had always asked why when others asked what or how. The examination hall was even more imposing than the preparation chamber. A perfect cube of gleaming metal, with each candidate assigned to an individual testing pod. The pods were designed to prevent any form of communication or collaboration, equipped with advanced sensors to detect cheating attempts. Sarah settled into her pod, a cramped but comfortable space with a single display screen and an input interface. The countdown timer showed 59 minutes and 30 seconds. Around her, she could see the faint outlines of other candidates in their pods, but she couldn't make out any details through the privacy barriers. Attention candidates, came the announcement. The examination begins now. Your question is displayed on your screen. You have 1 hour. Sarah looked at her display, and her heart sank. The question appeared simple, almost insultingly. So, what is the most important thing? That was it. No context. No parameters. No specifications about the scope of the answer or the criteria for evaluation. Just 5 words that could mean anything or nothing. Sarah stared at the question for a full minute, her mind racing. This had to be some kind of trick. The most difficult examination in the galaxy couldn't possibly hinge on such a basic question. But as the seconds ticked by, she realized that the simplicity was exactly what made it so difficult. Around her, she could hear the faint sounds of other candidates working, the soft hum of Etherian meditation techniques, the rapid clicking of Klaxon thought processing, the harmonic vibrations of Vorton analysis. Everyone seemed to be approaching the question with sophisticated methodologies. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think. What would the Academy be looking for in an answer? Philosophical depth? Scientific accuracy? Mathematical precision? The question was so open-ended that any answer could be justified, and any answer could be wrong. She thought about her life on the mining station, about the countless hours she had spent staring out the stars, and wondering about the bigger picture. She thought about the conversations she had had with fellow workers from dozens of different species, each with their own perspectives on life, purpose, and meaning. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the question wasn't asking for an objective truth, but for something more personal, more fundamental. Sarah opened her eyes and began to type. The timer showed 43 minutes remaining when she finished. She had written only a few sentences, far less than most of the elaborate responses she imagined the other candidates were crafting. But, looking at her answer, she felt a strange sense of certainty. She had either just secured her future or destroyed it entirely. There would be no way to know until the results were announced. As the final seconds of the examination ticked away, Sarah sat back in her pod and waited for her fate to be decided. The examination pods retracted simultaneously as the hour concluded, leaving the candidates exposed in the vast hall. Sarah blinked in the sudden brightness, her eyes adjusting to see hundreds of other beings who looked as uncertain as she felt. The air buzzed with nervous energy and the distinct sounds of different species expressing anxiety in their native ways. Candidates, please remain in your positions, announced the same melodious voice from before. Results will be processed and announced within the next 30 minutes. During this time, discussion of your answers is strictly prohibited. Sarah tried to read the expressions of those around her, but alien facial features made it nearly impossible. The Etherian who had been sitting next to her during the briefing was floating slightly, his 4 arms wrapped around his torso in what she guessed was distress. Several klaxons were clicking rapidly in patterns that sounded agitated. Even the normally stoic Vortons seemed to be humming at frequencies that suggested unease. A small part of Sarah felt oddly calm. She had given her honest answer to an impossible question. Whether it was right or wrong, she had stayed true to herself. That had to count for something, even if it didn't get her into the academy. Dean Corvash materialized in the center of the hall again, his ancient features unreadable. Behind him, several other faculty members from different species flanked him, a clear indication that the evaluation process involved perspective from across the galactic community. Candidates, the dean began, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. In 3,000 years of conducting this examination, we have seen responses of extraordinary creativity, intelligence, and insight. We have read dissertations on quantum mechanics, philosophical treatises on the nature of consciousness, mathematical proofs that have advanced our understanding of the universe, and artistic expressions that have moved us to tears. Sarah felt her heart sinking. Her simple, brief answer suddenly seemed woefully inadequate compared to what the dean was describing. However, the dean continued, "We must remember that wisdom is not always found in complexity. Sometimes, the most profound truths are also the most simple." A ripple of hope passed through Sarah's chest. This year's examination has yielded results that our faculty has spent considerable time discussing. For the first time in the Academy's history, we have received an answer that not only demonstrates correct understanding of the question's true nature, but does so with a clarity and insight that has forced us to reconsider our own assumptions. The hall had become so quiet that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. The candidate who has achieved this breakthrough comes from a species that joined our galactic community relatively recently. A species that, perhaps due to their youth in the cosmic community, brings fresh perspectives to ancient questions. Sarah's pulse began to race. Humans were indeed among the newest members of the galactic community. Could the dean be referring to her? Would candidate Sarah Chun please step forward? The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Around her, hundreds of heads, sensors, and sensory organs turned to focus on her. She felt her legs wobble as she stood and made her way to the center of the hall, acutely aware of every step echoing in the vast space. Dean Corvash's 3 eyes studied her with an intensity that was both frightening and oddly comforting. "Miss Chun, would you please share your answer with your fellow candidates?" Sarah's mouth felt dry as she looked out at the sea of alien faces staring at her. Some looked curious, others skeptical, a few appeared openly hostile. She cleared her throat and tried to project her voice across the hall. I answered, "The most important thing is to keep asking what the most important thing is." A wave of murmurs swept through the hall. She heard clicks, chirps, harmonic vibrations, and sounds she couldn't identify as hundreds of beings processed her words. Dean Corvash raised one of his hands, and silence returned. "Miss Chun, would you elaborate on your reasoning?" Sarah took a deep breath. The question seemed designed to have no correct answer, or to have every answer be correct, depending on your perspective. I realized that the act of continuously questioning, of never accepting that we've found the final answer, is what drives all learning, all progress, all understanding. The moment we stop asking what's the most important thing is the moment we stop growing. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Every species here probably has a different answer based on their culture, their history, their biology, and they're all right within their contexts. But the thing that makes us want to come to an academy, to push the boundaries of knowledge, to explore the unknown, that's the drive, to keep questioning. That's what's truly important. The hall remained silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, a klaxon began a slow, rhythmic clicking. Sarah had heard this pattern before during her cargo runs. It was a sign of respect and acknowledgement. Soon, other klaxons joined in. The Etherians began a low humming that she recognized as appreciation. Even some of the Vortons adjusted their harmonic frequencies to what sounded like approval. Dean Corvash waited for the sounds to fade before speaking again. Miss Chin's answer demonstrates an understanding that has eluded 40,000 previous candidates. The question, "What is the most important thing?" is not seeking a specific answer. It is testing whether the candidate understands that the pursuit of knowledge is itself the goal. He turned to address the entire hall. For 3 millennia, candidates have attempted to provide the correct answer: love, knowledge, wisdom, peace, survival, advancement, art, science, philosophy. All worthy concepts, all meaningful in their own right, but all finite, all endpoints. Sarah began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. Miss Chun recognized that the question itself is more important than any answer it might generate, that the Academy's true purpose is not to provide final answers, but to cultivate minds that will never stop asking questions. A holographic display materialized above the dean's head, showing statistics that made Sarah's knees weak. Of the 397 candidates who had taken the examination that day, only she had approached the question from this angle. The others had provided exactly what the dean had described: specific answers ranging from complex scientific theories to elaborate philosophical frameworks. "This brings me to an unusual announcement," Dean Korvash continued. "Miss Chin's response has prompted the Academy faculty to make a significant decision. For 3,000 years, we have operated under the assumption that knowledge has destinations, that education has endpoints, that wisdom can be achieved." Sarah sensed something momentous coming. Miss Chun has reminded us that the most important function of any educational institution is not to provide answers, but to ensure that the questions continue to be asked. Therefore, the Academy has decided to restructure its core philosophy. Beginning immediately, we will implement what we are calling the Chun Principle, the recognition that perpetual inquiry is the foundation of all meaningful education. The hall erupted in a cacophony of sounds as hundreds of beings reacted to this announcement. Sarah felt dizzy. Not only had she somehow passed the impossible test, but her answer had apparently triggered a fundamental change in how the galaxy's most prestigious institution approached education. Dean Korvash raised his hand again. "Miss Chun, you are of course granted immediate admission to the Academy with full privileges. However, I hope you will also consider accepting a position on our faculty as an advisor on educational philosophy. It seems we have much to learn from your species' approach to learning." Sarah stared at him, speechless. She had come hoping for a chance to study. Instead, she was being offered a chance to teach. Yes, she managed to stammer. "I accept both offers." As the formal ceremony concluded and candidates began to file out of the hall, some celebrating their acceptance into various programs, others contemplating their rejection, Sarah found herself surrounded by curious beings from across the galaxy. They peppered her with questions about human educational methods, about her background, about how she had approached the impossible question. But the most interesting reaction came from an elderly Etherian professor who floated over to her as the crowd began to thin. "Miss Chun," the professor said in accented but clear Standard Galactic, "I have been teaching at this academy for 400 years. I have seen thousands of brilliant minds pass through these halls. But I have never seen anyone fundamentally change the institution's philosophy with a single sentence." Sarah smiled, still processing everything that had happened. "I just answered honestly." The professor replied with what she was learning to recognize as an Etherian smile. And that perhaps is the most human trait of all. 3 months after the examination, Sarah found herself standing in front of her first class as an advisor at the Academy. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was teaching beings who had centuries of education and experience, many of whom belonged to species that had developed faster than light travel when humans were still discovering agriculture. The lecture hall was smaller than the examination chamber, but no less impressive, with seating arrangements that accommodated the diverse physical needs of different species. Floating platforms for Etherians, resonance chambers for Vortons, specialized perches for the bird-like Nexari, and traditional seating for the more humanoid races. "Today we're going to discuss something that might make you uncomfortable," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic enhancement system. "We're going to talk about being wrong." A ripple of surprise sounds passed through the audience. The concept of discussing wrongness in an academic setting was unusual, particularly at the Academy where the pursuit of correctness had traditionally been paramount. Sarah had spent the past months studying the Academy's educational methods, and what she had discovered both fascinated and troubled her. The institution produced incredibly knowledgeable graduates, but they often struggled with uncertainty, with questions that had no clear answers, with the kind of ambiguous problems that defined real-world challenges. How many of you have ever been taught that it's acceptable to not know something? She asked. A few hands raised hesitantly, mostly from younger students, Sarah noticed. How many of you have been encouraged to ask questions that your professors couldn't answer? Fewer hands this time. And how many of you have been told that changing your mind about a fundamental belief is a sign of intellectual strength rather than weakness? Almost no hands remained raised. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. This is what humans call the certainty trap. We become so focused on having the right answers that we forget how to ask the right questions. An elderly klaxon in the front row clicked a pattern that her translation device rendered as skepticism. Advisor Chun, surely you cannot suggest that knowledge and certainty are negative qualities? The Academy has produced the galaxy's greatest minds precisely because we emphasize rigorous analysis and definitive conclusions. I'm not suggesting that knowledge is negative, Sarah replied. I'm suggesting that the illusion of complete knowledge can be dangerous. Let me give you an example. She activated a holographic display showing a three-dimensional maze. For 2,000 years, the Academy taught that this particular mathematical problem had no solution. Generations of brilliant minds accepted this as fact and moved on to other challenges. Then, 50 years ago, a young Nexary student who didn't know it was supposed to be impossible solved it in an afternoon. Murmurs of recognition passed through the class. The story was well known among Academy students. The student succeeded precisely because she didn't know it was impossible. Her ignorance of the established certainty became her greatest advantage. Sarah changed the display to show a timeline of scientific discoveries. Throughout galactic history, our greatest breakthroughs have come from individuals who were willing to question what everyone else knew to be true. They succeeded not despite their uncertainty, but because of it. A Vorton student harmonized the question, but how do we distinguish between productive uncertainty and mere ignorance? Surely some certainties are necessary for progress. Excellent question, Sarah said, genuinely pleased. This is where human educational philosophy diverges from traditional galactic approaches. We've learned to embrace what we call confident uncertainty. She could see confusion on faces around the room, so she elaborated. Confident uncertainty means being absolutely certain that you don't have all the answers, and being excited about that fact rather than threatened by it. It means approaching every problem with the assumption that your current understanding is incomplete, and that this incompleteness represents opportunity rather than failure. Sarah had been experimenting with this approach in her own advanced courses, and the results had been remarkable. Students who learned to embrace uncertainty as a tool became more creative, more adaptable, and more innovative in their thinking. Let me show you something, she said, activating another holographic display. This one showed data from recent Academy research projects. Over the past 3 months, I've been tracking the performance of students in traditional courses versus those in experimental courses that emphasize uncertainty-based learning. The data was striking. Students in the experimental courses were producing more original research, finding novel solutions to established problems, and demonstrating greater adaptability when faced with unexpected challenges. The students who learned to be comfortable with not knowing became better at discovering new knowledge, Sarah explained. An Etherian student floated higher in his seat, clearly agitated. But this approach seems chaotic. How can we build reliable, scientific understanding if we constantly question our foundations? Sarah smiled. This was exactly the kind of question she had hoped for. That's the beautiful paradox of confident uncertainty. By constantly questioning our foundations, we actually make them stronger. Every time we test a belief and find it holds up, we increase our confidence in it. Every time we discover a belief is wrong, we improve our understanding of reality. She gestured to the room around them. The Academy itself is built on this principle, even if it hasn't always recognized it. For 3,000 years, you've been testing the intelligence and wisdom of candidates with an impossible question. The institution grew stronger not because the question had a right answer, but because it forced people to grapple with uncertainty. The silence in the room was thoughtful rather than resistant. Sarah could see minds working, processing this new way of thinking about knowledge and learning. "I want to try an experiment," she announced. "I'm going to give you a problem that has no known solution. Your assignment is not to solve it, but to explore it, to ask questions about it, to discover what we don't know about it, and to be excited about that ignorance." The problem she presented was one that had puzzled galactic researchers for centuries: the apparent contradiction between quantum mechanics and gravitational theory in regions of extreme space-time curvature. Traditionally, students would be assigned to study existing theories and choose the most promising approach. Sarah's assignment was different. "I want you to identify 10 things we don't know about this problem. I want you to formulate questions that no one has thought to ask yet. I want you to find the gaps in our understanding and treat those gaps as opportunities for discovery." As students began to leave the classroom, Sarah noticed something that hadn't happened in her previous lectures. Instead of forming study groups focused on reviewing established knowledge, they were clustering in small discussion groups, asking each other questions, challenging assumptions. The Etherian who had seemed most resistant to her ideas floated over to her desk. "Advisor Chun, I find your approach disturbing but also intriguing. In my culture, uncertainty is associated with youth and inexperience. Wisdom comes from accumulating certainties. And that's exactly why this perspective is valuable," Sarah replied. "Your species has contributed enormously to galactic civilization precisely because of your methodical approach to knowledge accumulation. But imagine what might be possible if you combine that rigor with a willingness to embrace uncertainty." The student was quiet for a moment, his four arms moving in patterns that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. "You suggest that wisdom might come not from having answers, but from knowing which questions to ask." "Now you're getting it," Sarah said. As the weeks passed, word of Sarah's unconventional teaching methods spread throughout the academy. Some faculty members were skeptical, even hostile. They worried that encouraging uncertainty would undermine the institution's standards and reputation. But others, particularly younger professors, began incorporating elements of uncertainty-based learning into their own courses. The real test came when the Academy received an unexpected challenge. The Galactic Council had presented them with a crisis that threatened the stability of 3-star systems. An unknown phenomenon was causing stars to dim and planetary systems to destabilize, and traditional scientific approaches had failed to identify either the cause or a solution. Dean Corvash called Sarah to his office, his 3 eyes reflecting a mixture of desperation and hope. "Miss Chun, the Council has given us 30 days to propose a solution, or they will implement emergency evacuation procedures that will displace billions of beings. Our most experienced researchers have spent weeks applying conventional methodologies without success." Sarah understood what he was asking. "You want me to try the uncertainty approach? I want you to teach our researchers to ask the questions they haven't thought to ask." Sarah looked out the window of the dean's office, where she could see the Academy's greatest minds hurrying between laboratories and libraries, their faces etched with stress and frustration. They were operating under the assumption that the solution lay in what they already knew or in logical extensions of existing knowledge. "Give me access to all the research data," she said, "and gather your best minds in the main conference hall. It's time to show them what humans do best." "And what is that?" Sarah smiled with a confidence that surprised even her. "We admit we don't know what we're doing, and then we figure out anyway." The Academy's main conference hall had been transformed into what Sarah privately called organized chaos. Holographic displays showing stellar data floated throughout the room. While researchers from 17 different species worked in clusters, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, hums, and harmonic frequencies. Sarah stood at the center of it all, feeling simultaneously overwhelmed and energized. 28 days remained before the Galactic Council would begin evacuation procedures, and the Academy's finest minds had made little progress using traditional approaches. "Tell me what you know," Sarah had said at the beginning of their first session. The response had been a flood of technical data, theoretical frameworks, and detailed analyses that would have taken her months to fully comprehend. "Now tell me what you don't know," she had added, and the room had fallen silent. That silence had been the beginning of their breakthrough. Dr. HFY, a senior Etherian astrophysicist, floated over to where Sarah was reviewing the latest data streams. His four arms gestured expressively as he spoke. "Advisor Chun, I must admit that your approach has yielded some unexpected insights." Sarah looked up from a particularly puzzling energy reading, such as, "We have always assumed that the stellar dimming phenomenon was uniform across affected systems. Your suggestion that we map what we don't know led us to realize that we have no data on electromagnetic variance in the 17-hour intervals between our standard observation cycles. And when you looked at those intervals," Dr. HFY's expression showed what she had learned to recognize as Etherian excitement. "The dimming is not uniform. There are pattern variations that suggest the phenomenon might be artificial rather than natural." This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. By forcing the researchers to acknowledge the gaps in their knowledge, they had discovered that their assumptions about the nature of the problem might be fundamentally wrong. "What other assumptions are we making?" Sarah asked the room in general. Dr. Corvex, a Klaxon xenobiologist, clicked rapidly before his translation device rendered his response. "We have assumed that the phenomenon affects only stellar bodies, but we have not investigated its potential impact on dark matter distributions or subspace field fluctuations. And we assumed it was a natural cosmic event," added Professor Minera, a Vorton theoretical physicist. "But if Dr. HFY's pattern analysis is correct, we might be looking at technology we don't understand." Sarah felt a familiar thrill, the excitement of approaching a problem from a completely different angle. What if we stopped trying to figure out what's causing the phenomenon and instead focused on what the phenomenon is trying to achieve? The suggestion created a ripple of confused sounds throughout the hall. Sarah realized she was asking them to engage in speculation, something that made most academic minds uncomfortable. "I understand your hesitation," she said, "but humans have a saying, when you can't find the forest for the trees, stop looking at trees and start looking for forests. Maybe we've been so focused on the technical aspects that we've missed the bigger picture." Dr. HFY's three eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep consideration. "You're suggesting we approach this as an intelligence problem rather than a physics problem?" "I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities, including ones that make us uncomfortable." Sarah activated the main holographic display and began manipulating the data to show something that had been bothering her since she first reviewed the research. "Look at the affected systems. What do they have in common?" The researchers had obviously considered this question before, but they approached it again with fresh eyes. Climate types, stellar classifications, planetary compositions, technological development levels of any inhabited worlds. All the standard categories had been analyzed without revealing meaningful patterns. "What about location relative to galactic communication networks?" Sarah asked. Dr. Corvex's antennae twitched as he processed this angle. "That's an unusual metric for stellar phenomena. But, humor me, map the affected systems against the galactic communication grid." As the data overlaid, a pattern emerged that made several researchers emit sounds of surprise. The affected systems were all positioned at key nodes in the galaxy's faster-than-light communication network. "That can't be coincidental," whispered Professor Minera, her harmonic frequencies shifting to convey amazement. Sarah felt her heart racing. What if the stellar dimming isn't the problem? What if it's a side effect of something else, something targeting our communication infrastructure? The implications hit the room like a wave. If someone or something was deliberately targeting the galactic communication network, the dimming stars were just collateral damage from a much larger threat. But who would have such capability? Dr. Vexai asked. And why target communications? Sarah's mind was racing through possibilities. Her experience on a mining station had taught her to think in terms of practical motives rather than theoretical frameworks. Who benefits when people can't communicate with each other? Someone who wants to operate without oversight. Dr. Corvex clicked grimly. Or someone who wants to prevent coordination of a response to their activities. Professor Minera harmonized. The room fell silent as the researchers contemplated this new direction. Instead of a mysterious natural phenomenon, they might be dealing with deliberate sabotage on a galactic scale. Sarah began pulling up data on deep space monitoring stations near the affected systems. If this is technological rather than natural, there should be signatures we can detect. The question is, what are we looking for? Dr. Vexai was already manipulating holographic controls, his four arms working with practiced efficiency. Gravitational anomalies, exotic matter traces, subspace disturbances, anything that suggests artificial manipulation of space-time. Over the next several hours, the research team worked with an urgency and focus that Sarah found inspiring. By embracing uncertainty and abandoning their preconceived notions about the nature of the problem, they had opened up entirely new avenues of investigation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Zixera, a young Nexari student who had been quietly analyzing communication logs, suddenly emitted a sharp whistle that cut through all other sounds in the hall. "I found something," she announced, her feathered crest raised in excitement. "There's a pattern in the communication disruptions that precede stellar dimming events." Sarah hurried over to the student's workstation, followed by several senior researchers. "What kind of pattern?" "The communications don't just stop," Zixera explained, her talons clicking rapidly across holographic interfaces. "They're being rerouted through a single point before termination. All affected communications are being directed to coordinates in the void sector." The void sector was a region of space that had been considered empty. No stars, no planets, no known objects of any kind. It was used primarily as a reference point for navigation calculations. "Someone is intercepting our communications," Dr. Vexai said, his voice filled with implications. "They're not just disrupting the network, they're stealing the data." Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The stellar dimming is a byproduct of whatever technology they're using to tap into the communication network. The question is, who are they, and what do they want with galactic communications? As if summoned by her question, an emergency alert began flashing throughout the academy. Dean Corvash's voice echoed through the communication system, tense with urgency. "All faculty and researchers report to emergency protocol stations immediately. We have just received word that the phenomenon has accelerated. 3 more systems have begun showing stellar dimming, and the Galactic Council has moved up the evacuation timeline." Sarah looked around at the researchers, seeing determination mixed with fear on their various features. They had found a lead, but time was running out faster than anticipated. "How long do we have?" Dr. Vexai asked. Sarah checked the countdown display that had been running constantly in the corner of her vision. 14 days until evacuation begins. But if the phenomenon is accelerating, we might have even less time than that. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Billions of lives hung in the balance, and their only hope was a human cargo hauler who had stumbled onto an academic career by asking the right question. "Then, we'd better figure out who's lurking in the void sector," she said. "And we'd better do it fast." The Academy's Deep Space Observatory had never been intended for the kind of intensive analysis Sarah's team was conducting. Built for academic research and long-term stellar observations, it was now being pushed to its limits as they tried to penetrate the mysteries of the void sector. 8 days remained before the Galactic Council would begin evacuations, and Sarah found herself running on caffeine supplements and determination. Around her, the research team worked in shifts, maintaining constant surveillance of the empty region of space that might hold the key to saving billions of lives. I'm detecting artificial gravitational disturbances, Dr. Vexhai announced from his monitoring station, his four arms dancing across holographic controls. Something massive is operating in the void sector, but it's using some kind of masking technology. Sarah hurried over to review his data. The gravitational signatures were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were definitely artificial. How massive are we talking? At least the size of a small moon, possibly larger. But the interesting thing is that the mass signatures are inconsistent with known materials. Think about it, Sarah replied, beginning to pace as her mind worked through the implications. The communication interception, the stellar dimming, the gravitational anomalies. What if these are side effects of something else entirely? Zixera, the young Nexari student who had discovered the communication rerouting pattern, emitted a thoughtful whistle. Like what? Sarah pulled up a holographic display showing the affected star systems and their positions relative to major galactic features. What if someone is trying to establish their own communication network and doesn't understand how it's interfering with existing systems? The observatory fell silent as the researchers considered this possibility. It would explain the seemingly random nature of the phenomena, the focus on communication nodes, and the apparent lack of direct hostile action. A new species making first contact. Dr. Korvex clicked slowly. That would explain why we don't recognize their technology. But the scale of their operations suggests technological capabilities far beyond our own. Professor Minera harmonized with concern. If they can manipulate stellar output as a side effect of their communications technology, they represent either a tremendous opportunity or a catastrophic threat. Sarah felt the familiar excitement of approaching a breakthrough. There's only one way to find out. We need to make contact. The suggestion sent the research team into an uproar. Direct contact with an unknown alien intelligence was far beyond their academic mandate, particularly one that possessed technology capable of affecting stellar phenomena. The risks are enormous, Dr. Vexhai protested. We don't know their intentions, their capabilities, or even their basic psychology. But doing nothing guarantees catastrophe, Sarah countered. The Galactic Council will evacuate those star systems, displacing billions of beings, and we'll never know if this was all just a misunderstanding. Dean Korvash's voice suddenly echoed through the observatory's communication system. All senior research staff report to Conference Room Alpha immediately. We have received new developments from the Galactic Council. As the team filed into the conference room, Sarah noticed the Dean's expression was grim. Beside him stood Admiral Threxka, a high-ranking military officer from the Galactic Defense Force, and Counselor Vimesh, a diplomatic representative from the Council. The situation has deteriorated, Dean Korvash announced without preamble. 2 more star systems have begun showing signs of stellar instability, and preliminary evacuation has begun in the outer colonies. More critically, we have detected what appear to be probe ships emerging from the void sector. The holographic display activated, showing sleek, unfamiliar vessels that seem to bend light around their edges. Their design was unlike anything in galactic databases, with flowing curves and energy signatures that defied conventional understanding. These ships are approaching inhabited systems. Admiral Threxka added, her insectoid features rigid with military concern. We must assume hostile intent until proven otherwise. Sarah felt her heart sinking. The opportunity for peaceful contact was slipping away, replaced by the possibility of galactic war against an unknown enemy with superior technology. Admiral, with respect, I think you're making the same mistake we've been making, she said, knowing she was probably overstepping her authority. You're assuming malicious intent based on fear of the unknown. The Admiral's compound eyes fixed on Sarah with what she recognized as hostility. Young human, this is not an academic exercise. Those ships could represent an existential threat to galactic civilization. Or they could represent beings trying to figure out why their communication attempts are being ignored, Sarah replied, standing her ground. What if they're sending diplomatic missions to the systems they've been trying to contact? Counselor Vimesh, who had remained silent until now, spoke with the measured tones of a professional diplomat. Explain your reasoning, Advisor Chun. Sarah activated the research team's compiled data. Everything we've discovered suggests these beings are trying to establish contact through technological means we don't understand. The stellar dimming, the communication interference, even the gravitational anomalies, they're all consistent with someone operating powerful technology without understanding its side effects on existing infrastructure. She highlighted the pattern analysis Sarah had discovered. Look at the timing. Each probe ship emergence corresponds to periods of increased communication attempts from the void sector. They're not launching an invasion, they're sending envoys. That's a significant assumption, Admiral Threxka replied skeptically. Yes, it is, Sarah admitted. But it's an assumption based on evidence rather than fear. And, if I'm right, we're about to turn a potential alliance into a war through misunderstanding. The room fell silent as the military and diplomatic officials weighed her words against their responsibilities. Sarah could feel the weight of galactic history hanging in the balance. Dean Corvash broke the silence. What do you propose, Miss Chun? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she was about to suggest something that would either save countless lives or get her branded as a dangerous idealist. Let me make contact. Give me a ship, and let me approach the void sector with a communication array. If these beings are trying to establish dialogue, someone should respond. Absolutely not. Admiral Threxka responded immediately. The risk to Academy personnel is I volunteer to go with her, Dr. Vexhai interrupted, floating forward. The scientific value of such contact, if successful, would be immeasurable. As do I, clicked Dr. Corvex. And I, harmonized Professor Minera. Sarah looked around at her colleagues with amazement. The same beings who had initially resisted her uncertainty-based approach to learning were now willing to risk their lives based on her uncertain hypothesis about alien intentions. Counselor Vinemesh exchanged glances with the Admiral and the Dean. The Galactic Council has authorized emergency protocols. If there is any reasonable possibility of peaceful resolution, we must pursue it. Admiral Threxka's expression remained skeptical, but she nodded grudgingly. Very well, but you'll go aboard a Defense Force vessel with full military escort. And if these aliens show any sign of hostile intent, the mission is aborted immediately. 6 hours later, Sarah found herself aboard the GDF cruiser Harmony's Edge, watching the stars shift as they entered faster-than-light travel toward the void sector. The irony of the ship's name wasn't lost on her. They were literally seeking harmony with the unknown. Dr. Vexhai floated beside her at the observation deck, his 4 arms working on final calibrations to their communication array. I must confess, Advisor Chun, this is the most terrifying and exciting moment of my 400-year career. Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar combination of uncertainty and anticipation that had driven her entire academic journey. That's how you know you're asking the right questions. As they dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the void sector, sensors immediately detected the massive structure hidden within seemingly empty space. It was beautiful and alien, a flowing construct that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. Incoming transmission, announced the ship's communications officer. It's incredibly complex, multidimensional, using quantum entanglement protocols I've never seen. Sarah moved to the communication station, her heart racing. Can you decode it? Partially. It seems to be an apology. The translation that came through was halting and uncertain, but the message was clear. The beings in the void sector have been trying to make contact with galactic civilization for months, using their own technological methods. They had not realized that their communication attempts were interfering with existing stellar and communication systems. More importantly, they were asking for help. Their own star system was dying, and they needed assistance finding a new home for their civilization. Sarah looked around at her colleagues and the ship's crew, seeing wonder and relief replacing fear and suspicion. By choosing to approach the unknown with curiosity rather than hostility, they had discovered not an enemy, but potential allies facing their own crisis. "Admiral," she said into her communication device, "I think we're going to need a much bigger diplomatic team." As the Harmony's Edge began formal first contact protocols with the beings who would later be known as the Architects, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a cargo hauler to the center of galactic diplomacy. It had all started with a simple recognition that the most important thing was to keep asking what the most important thing was. Sometimes, she realized, the most profound answers came not from what you knew, but from being brave enough to admit what you didn't know, and being curious enough to find out. The galaxy had just become a much larger and more interesting place, and Sarah Chin couldn't wait to see what questions would arise next.